Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Sachs, Dr. Pachauri. The way we're going to try and run this is as a discussion. We've got half an hour. I don't think that you could find two people who are better placed to help us make the link from the MDG process and the MDG discussion into the discussion around climate change and sustainable development goals than our panel this morning. And so the way we'll start is I'll ask Professor Sachs to get us going. He'll speak for about 10 minutes. We'll have then a brief exchange. Dr. Pachauri will make a contribution, and then perhaps we'll try and take a couple of questions and wrap up in about half an hour. So over to you, Dr. Sachs.
Good morning. Nicholas, thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, it's always an enormous pleasure and honor to be part of DSDS. And it's precisely because of our overfilled diplomatic agenda this year that I'm here in New York rather than with you in Delhi, where I would prefer to be. But we have very extensive discussions this very week at the United Nations on the 2015 agenda. So I'm called to be in New York right now. You know, there will be no more important year, no more make or break year for sustainable development than this year, than 2015. This is our best chance, and I think for our generation, perhaps the only chance we have to change the course of global diplomacy and global economic direction towards sustainable development. The diplomatic agenda is packed. On the one side, that means it's a bit treacherous. On the other side, it means we have an opportunity to make some very big and important agreements. The fact is, as you know, two crucial processes came together for this year. The Millennium Development Goals were set already back in the year 2000 to finish this year in the year 2015. So there was already a decision made, set many years ago, that this would be a transition year to new objectives. In 2012, on the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit, the member states of the United Nations said that the post-2015 development agenda should be based on sustainable development. That is, on a philosophy of combining economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Now, it happened that in addition to that process, the climate negotiations are also culminating this year in Paris. That's because of a different timeline, which also ends now. When Copenhagen failed to reach a climate agreement back in 2009, the government set a new timeline for one more try, one more chance to reach an agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in 2010 in Cancun, they looked forward to December 2015 at COP21 to be that moment when finally we reach an agreement to implement the Framework Convention 23 years after it was signed. So we have two crucial processes within the space of just 2 months. In September, the UN member states will adopt new sustainable development goals. And in December, the same governments will meet in Paris to finalize an agreement on climate change. Now, if that were not enough, in contemplating these two big summits, the developing countries said, but wait a minute, if we're going to achieve sustainable development, if we're going to achieve a meaningful climate agreement, we need a financial arrangement that underpins sustainable development and that underpins climate change mitigation and adaptation. So the developing countries asked for a third process, and that is a summit on financing for sustainable development, which was set for this July 12 to 15, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. So if you add it up, ladies and gentlemen, we have 3 high-level summits to take place in just 6 months. Financing for sustainable development in July, adopting sustainable development goals in September, and finalizing a climate agreement in December. It's an extremely crowded agenda. Not one of these 3 negotiations is close to completion. The time is very short. There are 193 member states that are part of all 3 of these negotiations. And so we have a very filled diplomatic agenda this year. If we get it right, we can do nothing less than changing course so that we can have the safety and assurance to know that global economic growth and development will be aligned with the physical planetary needs, not only of climate, but biodiversity, management of ecosystems, and the fairness of the economic systems as part of sustainable development. Just to conclude, Nicholas, to summarize where we stand right now, there are some basic parameters that are shared but not yet firmly in place. For the Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 highlight goals or headline goals that have already been designated. But now the work is to get those goals into a smaller number, more meaningful, and to combine them with targets and indicators and a process of accountability to make these new SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals meaningful. For the financing summit in July, there is a basic understanding that this summit will combine several different objectives. The first is to assure the future of the official development assistance, the aid process. Second, to define climate financing, the so-called $100 billion per year promise that the rich countries have made to help the poor countries in climate mitigation and adaptation. The third part of this process is to mobilize private capital to scale up tremendously the levels of investment in sustainable infrastructure in both the rich and the poor countries. And the fourth pillar of the July meeting is to try to reform the regulatory framework of international finance to cut down sharply on the corruption, the illicit flows, and the financing of unsustainable investments. And then finally, to turn to December, I think all of us hope that at the core of the December agreement is the 2 degrees Celsius upper limit on warming that governments have agreed is the absolute limit on the permissible extent of human-induced climate change based on the IPCC evidence that Pachauri and his colleagues have developed so persuasively and effectively over the years. So the governments have said, we accept the 2-degree limit on warming, but they have not yet implemented a framework to accomplish that. The true test of the December agreement is whether it truly will enable the world to stay below the 2 degrees C upper limit. This is a huge agenda. In other words, time is short, and we do not have a backup plan. We must succeed in 2015. Back to you, Nicholas.
Thank you very much. That's a pretty compelling picture of the level of urgency that arises when you have such complex machinery trying to mesh in a very short time frame. And I want to pose a question that really arises out of living and working in Delhi, where we're having this meeting, and where certainly the readers of our newspaper slog to work through some pretty terrible air every day, but at the same time really feel that this is a moment when India is emerging, re-emerging economically and onto the global stage, and are anxious to see India's opportunities for growth and development be fully exploited, and indeed very quickly exploited. So there's a big national debate underway around coal mining and access to carbon resources. There's another discussion around scaling up nuclear and scaling up solar. But in the very, very crunchy time frame that you've described, is it your sense now, being close to these discussions, that from the perspective of big developing countries like India, like China, and after all, President Obama left here without a firm commitment on carbon, although with a commitment to work together toward Paris, that from the big developing countries' perspective, that there is enough time to come up with a set of commitments that are clear enough and hard enough to get a realistic result, both in September and December. And on the other hand, from the rich countries, emerging from the very difficult economic period of the last 7 or 8 years, that 100 billion really is going to flow in genuine resources, in genuine commitments, rather than in high-sounding numbers that don't result in action on the ground.
Well, Nicholas, this is the core question for the world, and we don't have the answer to either of those. I would say that the 100 billion per year is the smaller of the two problems. We are, after all, a $100 trillion world economy. So to keep it in perspective, $100 billion just isn't all that much money these days. The rich world combined has an annual income of nearly $50 trillion per year. So we're talking about a very modest sum to mobilize. I think the work for that can get done. But the question is whether the world can agree on a framework that is truly bold. And of course, for a country like India, which is coal dependent, India wants to assure that there is a framework for development that is vigorous, that can bring India definitively out of poverty, that can continue rapid economic growth, and yet is also consistent with the world's planetary needs. And fundamentally, the answer to that is a transformation of the energy system from a fossil fuel-based energy system to a low and near zero carbon energy system by mid-century that would be based, as you said, on solar, wind, geothermal, hydropower, nuclear power, and potentially carbon capture and sequestration, plus related technologies like electric vehicles that would harness that energy in a clean way. Now, the project at the United Nations that I lead for Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, has been working with teams around the world, including at TERI, at IIM Ahmedabad, and other teams in 15 major emitting countries, to identify the technological pathways that will enable India to have rapid economic growth and combine it with a deep decarbonization. We firmly believe this is possible if the world also invests heavily in the technology breakthroughs to make sure that the performance standards of the low carbon technologies really come online effectively. And so in addition to a pathway of deep decarbonization, we're also calling for a major scaling up of the research, development, and demonstration of low carbon technology systems, whether it's electric vehicles, mass solar, storage of renewable energy, or other such technologies. And we believe that India, China, the United States, Europe, together must make a major technology push alongside the commitment to deep decarbonization. My answer in short is this is feasible. The goal is not to stop growth. The goal is to enable growth that is safe. And that requires technology transformation, and that requires global partnership. And that's what we need to build into the agreement in December.
Deep background is correct. You actually started your career in one great carbon-fueled Indian engineering miracle, the railways. You've also given us, through your work at the IPCC, the 2-degree limit. What, in your understanding of how things work in a major developing economy like this one, and in your global scientific and diplomatic work, do you think are the levers that have to move and can move between now and the end of the year to get this done?
Well, let me first clarify that when I started my career, I essentially started building diesel locomotives and the diesel engine, which is part of the locomotive. And that was clearly a step forward as far as steam locomotion is concerned. So I think I started in the right direction then, and I hope I've maintained that over the years. And then, of course, I branched off and I went into industrial engineering and economics. But I think what Jeff has said is absolutely right. I personally think we need to redefine growth and development. And he used the term partnership between North and South. I think one important part of that partnership needs to be the fact that countries of both North and South have to strive together as much for creating common solutions as for implementing them in their own territories. I mean, I find one of the terrible distortions that we have, for instance, in this country, is that anyone who's earned enough money wants to live just the way people do in North America. And to my mind, you can't have development in this country as long as everybody's aspirations are on buying a more powerful, a bigger car, on having several air conditioners in their homes. And therefore, I think we need to define, for instance, what kind of transportation system should we have? Should we not construct much better facilities for bicycles to be used in our cities? After all, it's happening in some very enlightened cities in the countries of the North. Should we not make it easier for pedestrians to walk on the roads rather than be overcome by the fear of being knocked over by drivers who in any case don't obey any traffic rules in this country? And the buildings that we have. I mean, if we take this hotel, I can assure you, if something similar was to be designed, we could do it. And you know, my institute has a large program on sustainable buildings. We could do it with energy consumption perhaps less than 50% of what's consumed in this hotel. I want to make a confession. In this country, I've never been to a shopping mall. Why? Because I think it's a monstrosity. Our shopping malls are identical to what you have in North America. Now, why couldn't we use our common sense, our intelligence and engineering capabilities to come up with something very different? So my submission is that, really speaking, the transition is going to be difficult, but it's certainly not beyond our reach. And this is what we've said in the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. For instance, by 2050, I mean, if we want to maintain this 2 degrees Celsius limit, then by 2050, we have to reduce emissions 40 to 70% over the 2010 value. And it's going to be tough, it's a challenge, but it's something which can be done with the options that Jeff has already talked about. But of course, we also have to make sure that the transition to a newer pattern of energy supply is accompanied by a similar transition to a newer form of consumption of energy in every sector of the economy. And that means there would also have to be some changes in the structure of what we build as an economy. I don't want to take too much time because this is really, in a sense, a discussion session. But what I want to say is that I'm a little concerned that, you know, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, it had been decided that 2013 to 2015 would be a review period when there would be a discussion on whether 2 degrees is what we adopt, or 1.5 degrees, or something different. One doesn't hear about that review under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So my feeling is that review is going to trickle on, it will go further, and whatever agreement we get in Paris will obviously be subjected to intense and regular scrutiny, because that's the nature of the beast. I don't think we can settle on climate change with the INDCs all adding up and possibly not being in line with the emissions scenario that we have estimated in the IPCC as giving us an assurance of no more than 2 degrees Celsius increase by the end of the century. So I would say Paris should be a strong agreement. I hope it will be, and I think the indications are that it will be, but it's not something at which the world should stop. There'll have to be constant review, constant scrutiny of where we are with respect to 2 degrees Celsius, and perhaps there'll also be questioning of whether 2 degrees is good enough. I want to leave you with just one number which I've used on several occasions. With the 2 degrees Celsius pathway that we have, we would still get sea level rise at the end of the century between 26 to 55 centimeters. And that's really not good enough. Let's keep that in mind. And sea level rise will continue beyond the 21st century. So what are we doing for the future of all living species on this planet? Thank you.
So with that urgency,
Nicholas?
yeah, come in. Please do come in.
I wanted to come in briefly to say that, as Pachi just said, the 2 degree upper limit itself could be too dangerous. But just so everybody is very clear, the business as usual trajectory is 4 to 6 degrees warming. In other words, we are on a catastrophic rate of warming right now, and many people think that the 2 degree upper limit is already unachievable. Pachi and I don't agree with that. We think it is achievable, and it may even be too high for safety. But the current trajectory is horrifying, because on the current trajectory, we could absolutely ruin the world food supply, not to mention the sea level rise, the storms, the loss of biodiversity, and all of the other calamities that would come with the business as usual trajectory. That's why we have to be sure that at least we can keep under the 2 degrees, and maybe we're going to find that we have to be even tougher than that as we continue to review. And I just want to add one thing that also to amplify what Pachi said. I was just in several Scandinavian cities in the last couple of weeks, and there you see people bicycling, beautiful walking paths, whether it's Oslo or Stockholm or Copenhagen. These are some of the most wonderful, beautiful, richest cities of the world, and they are on a path to zero net carbon emissions because they're determined to get there. So you can be rich, prosperous, and zero carbon And I think that's a very important lesson for us.
Certainly, we have millions of bicyclists here in Delhi. Unfortunately, as one of them, we have very little infrastructure. You can't get into this hotel compound if you arrive on your bicycle because it's perceived to be, something that smart people don't do.
Yeah, you have to be a risk taker and rather courageous to venture out on the streets on a bicycle.
That's true. And I wonder just, we're a little bit running out of time, but I want you to get both of your reaction to the, on the one hand, convergence of the multilateral discussion. On the other hand, there are discussions that are happening between countries and within countries. So the US announced with great fanfare an agreement with China. There's been a debate around whether India should itself commit to a peaking year for emissions. You spoke about the urgency of making sure that things continue beyond December. How important are these more patchwork initiatives, individual commitments, and bilateral deals? Are they a risk to the global process, or are they necessary to help make sure that things keep inching forward?
Well, if I could give a very brief response to that, I think we really need all kinds of initiatives. I don't see one as the enemy of the other. And frankly, as we've said in the fifth assessment report, you can't achieve what we are setting out to if individual groups and entities, whether it's countries or companies, try to work only to advance their own interests. I think what we really need is a multiplicity of efforts, including individuals making the effort. So I would say that if two countries decide to do something together, if some state in a particular country decides to do something, or a city, so much the better. I really think we need initiatives at all levels to optimize the benefits from whatever actions we take.
Thank you.
I would just add, if I could, we need all of the major economies of the world, and that certainly is India, China, European Union, the United States, to be in agreement that we must abide by the 2-degree upper limit. We must therefore all choose a path of deep decarbonization, but we must also cooperate technologically so that we can achieve it and so that it is not blocking the development of any country. India needs growth, it needs development, it needs to be assured that it can both decarbonize and achieve its development objectives. That's the purpose of global cooperation. We have to be very clear about that this year and put in place new creative mechanisms for the research and development and diffusion of low carbon technologies at the maximal rate. And every country, I want to urge, should be doing very detailed calculations of how to make that path to deep decarbonization. It's fascinating, it's possible. There are many choices, but this is the work, I believe, of governments that should be a very high priority just in these months to do that analytical work, to say, yes, here is how we can do this, given the resources that we have available, given the technologies that we have and that will come online in future years.
And the co-benefits can be substantial for a country like India.
Absolutely.
Energy security, much better environmental conditions at the local level, possibly higher employment opportunities.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our time, unfortunately. But I think what you've both described is a process which is perhaps easily captured on a website as a set of 17 initial goals to be drilled down perhaps to a tighter list and a few specific targets, but that really entails a transformation that is political, cultural, economic, and technical, of the kind that the global community has never attempted before. And something that we're trying to do with the fire literally in the basement. So an extraordinary challenge for everyone that's here and that's part of this community, and for everyone that's listening. I'd like to thank you very much for framing it with such urgency and such precision. And I'm sure that we'll hear a lot more from both of you between now and the end of the year. And hopefully we'll emerge from those two processes with enough clarity and enough measurability to create the kind of ongoing dialogue and the ongoing progress that's needed if we're going to, at worst, stop at 2%, and hopefully at best stay well within that number. So thanks very much to both of you, and thanks to everyone for joining us.
And thanks very much, Jeff. Do come here next year. I promise you better weather than in New York.
I have no doubt about it. I'd love to be with you and will be with you next year. So thank you very much, and best wishes to everybody in Delhi, and see you soon, Pachi. And Nicholas, thank you very much.